of development and tall buildings. And tonight is certainly not about an unknown building. And of course, tomorrow is the 18th anniversary of 9/11, and we want to take note of that as we did last year when we had a program also on September 10th that was featured two professional photographers, Camilo Vergara and Richard Barinholtz, who over their careers from probably the late 70s or so had insistently, regularly gone back to various vantage points and recorded the Twin Towers in their landscape. And so we asked them to review in a series of photographs, which you can see on our website in the video that recorded the evening, their personal tributes to the Trade Center. So tonight, though the conception for this evening is to frame the ideas of documentaries. The title for tonight's event is called Just Do It. And that's really in tribute to Annice Alt, who's reading her notes right here, who had relentlessly pursued a personal project that involved the Emmy Roth and Sons, then the architects, for a book that she did on architecture here in New York, residential architecture, apartment houses of Boke, Paris, and Boke, and what? Rad. And Rad, Boke and Rad. And for a number of years, and I know that she engaged the help of Kyle Johnson, who's also sitting there, tried to get Richard Roth to do a documentary, and Richard's daughter, Robin, is here, and she's texting him in order to kind of keep him in the loop. And before the end of the evening, he's going to be on the wall right there via FaceTime. So the arc of this evening goes from documentaries that are very recent, and the documentary in particular that we're going to look at the trailer of is on the subject of Les Robertson right here, the structural engineer, called Leaning Out. And it was made just last year. It is available to maybe stream on Netflix and a number of other options for seeing it. We'll show the short trailer here, and I think you'll see how the perspective of that film, which is as much a biography of Les and his career as it is kind of a tribute to the architectural and engineering works that he's realized over his career. So that is one kind of documentary that, in this case, by the husband and wife pair, Vasya and Leonard Mizinski, if I pronounced it correctly, represents the passionate entrepreneur documentarian who pursues a project usually on a shoestring budget, but turns it into a professional effort, airs it on public television, and accomplishes a single film in the series that pursues their kind of documentary style and voice. The second set of, we'll see that in the trailer, and also just a very few clips of Les speaking in order to show you the kinds of impromptu remarks that were added to that I think illuminate aspects of his career that might not have been on the record otherwise, right? So that's one thing about the evening. The second thing that we're going to look at is, first we're just going to hear the trailer for the voiceover, which anybody who saw any of New York, a documentary film series, and did everybody see it? Let me just, yeah, pretty much everybody. So James, there you go. The beginning of your life's work is widely known, even by people who maybe were too young to see it the first time around on TV. That series, which was directed by Rick Burns, but written by Rick and James Sanders, was a 8-part, 17.5-hour master narrative of the city of New York across time, and it ends with And it premiered in 1999, and it ends with an episode that was intended at the beginning that included the World Trade Center, but premiered or was released after 9/11, and so.
Not quite.
Okay, well he'll get everything right, which he will explain. But there are clips in the interviews, and you'll see Les interviewed that were done before 9/11, so they'll have a strange disjoint, emotional disjoint, and then James will tell you the real story behind all of that. So this kind of documentary, which is major corporate support, multiple part series shown on PBS through contracts with television, with organizations, represents a whole different scale of operation. Usually it involves grant writing before you ever get to hiring your film makers. And then the last of the evening is the homemade video, the do-it-yourself video that Annice made of Richard Roth, of which we'll see only small clips, because then we'll get to hear Richard talk. And the clips, from Florida. And the clips that we're going to show pertain to the World Trade Center and how the office organized the work, because Emory Roth and Sons were the architects of record for the World Trade Center when the design architect was Minoru Yamasaki and Les Robertson was the structural engineer. So when we all assemble then to talk and reflect on the role of documentaries and also the things that get left out of documentaries and the questions that we can ask of the other histories that don't make it, they're on the cutting room floor, or they're the backstory, and we still retain them, but there are all sorts of other questions that are raised. So we will raise a few of those since Les and Richard will be here to answer them. Okay, how about, in order to fill the void, could you talk about New York, a documentary? Great. James, take it away.
I'm like the guy in the vaudeville show. Warms up the audience.
I'll tell you when the...
Well, my training is as an architect. I went to Columbia University and Columbia School of Architecture, also MIT Graduate School of Architecture. When I was at Columbia College, I met Rick Burns, who was an English major. He went on to Cambridge University, came back to Columbia, and was pursuing his graduate program in English as his brother, Ken Burns, began making his early documentary films. The first one he made, of course, was on the Brooklyn Bridge, and that sort of sealed his reputation. And by about his third film, Ken asked Rick to start helping him, which Rick did. So Rick kind of learned the craft of making these documentary public television series, so to speak, at the side of Ken. And Rick and I had known each other slightly. He was, although we're the same age, I was 2 years ahead of him in school. We'd known each other very slightly in college, and but by the time we were in graduate school, we'd gotten to know each other a bit. I had decided to write a book called Celluloid Skyline, about New York and the movies. And Knopf, Alfred Knopf, publisher, had decided to publish it. Very exciting news for me. Knopf also published the Civil War companion volume. And somehow Rick and I kind of got reconnected. And I had in mind that it might be interesting to make a film based on Celluloid Skyline, which I still think is a great idea. It's a very expensive proposition because you have to license all the film clips, which are feature films, very expensive. Rick had read Power Broker of Robert Caro and was obsessed with the idea of making a film about Robert Moses. And so the well-worn story goes, we got together at the Algonquin Hotel one night in 1987. We had one too many martinis, and we decided to make a film about the entire history of New York. The kind of perfect, mad project you come up with when you're both quite drunk, which you then principle you totally forget about and think, remember that time? But in fact, in 1993, he had finished working on the film The Civil War with Ken, and had set out on his own to make his own films, and he made a film about Coney Island, which I reviewed, in fact, in the New York Times. We reconnected and decided, hey, let's try to do that New York idea. We wrote, actually I did most of the writing for a treatment on what was at the time I believe going to be a 5-part series, 5-part 10-hour series on the history of New York, which we submitted to the National Endowment for the Humanities. I have to say, stop by saying this was 1993. It was a different era then, a more generous era. There were multiple funding sources for these kinds of projects, which have subsequently really dried up. But in those days, the NEH gave very substantial, what they called scripting grants, to develop the script of these large projects. And we applied for one of them and got, as I recall, $375,000 from the NEH to make what was going to be a multi-million-dollar documentary film. So we were on our way. So from 93 to 94, Rick and I kind of wrote the script together, the first treatments and then script. And then we started production around 1994, 95, and then worked like maniacs for 5 years roughly, until November 1999. And we were producing the 5-part film, and we were producing a companion volume that Alfred Knopf published called New York: An Illustrated History. We got to realize that we were not going to be able to tell the entire story of New York in the 10-hour 5 parts, believe it or not. What we were able to do is tell the entire history of New York in the book in 7 chapters, with the intention that we would ultimately make a 7-part film, of which we'd get 5 parts on the air in November of 1999, which we did. And the book came out, and it was one of the biggest, most well-watched public television documentaries ever. I think it's rivaled only by the Civil War and by baseball and by jazz, basically by Ken's 3 biggest series, which was great because we really worried and wondered, would a film about New York find audience outside New York? And that's another way of saying we had to write the film in a way that was not parochial. It could not be a sort of those wonderful kind of Nathan's hot dog documentaries that you see about, you know, seltzer and 2 cents plane and all that stuff that appeals enormously to New Yorkers, but is absolutely mystifying to anyone who doesn't live in New York. It had to be, the premise of the show was that New York was a national story, and it was built for this show was built for a national audience. So the first 5 episodes came out in 1999. Sure enough, I should say that we were able to get substantial funding from other philanthropic sources, and our major private source of support was the then called Chase Manhattan Bank, which provided us, was our major corporate underwriter, I think for about $1 million. We finished the next 2 episodes in 2000, in late 99, well, we started in 2000, 2001. We completed the next 2 episodes, which I should say, the 5 episodes that we showed in 1999 took you through the completion of the Empire State Building in 1931. We thought that was a great moment to break the story and go on from there. So that was end of episode 5. Episode 6 was really about Robert Moses and the sort of 1930s and the great sort of titanic fight about the future of the city, between the sort of vehicle people, the automotive world, and the sort of pedestrian world. And then episode 7 took the story from the end of World War II to then today, which was 2000. And of course all the troubles New York had in the 1970s and 80s, the 60s and 70s, and how it, very briefly, how it kind of came out of that. We were preparing to air the show in the 3rd week of September. These things, of course, are planned months in advance. And of course, PBS has to do a whole marketing campaign and publicity campaign, and everything was kind of ramping up. And of course, September 11, 2001 happened. 2 weeks, or a week and a half, before we were going to air our 7th episode. Well, that was shocking. we didn't have time to remake the film. We did do one thing, which nobody knows except the few people I've told, and we changed the very end credits of the 7th film. Previously, we had, get ready, we had, as the credits rolled, we had a New York real estate developer talking about how very, very hot New York was. No. Donald J. Trump. Talking about New York is hot, New York is so hot. And we thought after what was then 15 and a half hours, you deserved a break. And in the time, you know, we treated Trump as sort of a comic relief. Well, that didn't seem so funny even then, back after September 11th. So we took that footage out and we put in a piece of footage that we had. This is itself a remarkable story. We had asked the Port Authority if we could make a copy of their documentary, 60mm documentary film about the building of the World Trade Center, which they said yes to. They gave us the actual original elements of the film. We copied it in full modern resolution, and we sent back the negative and the prints to the Port Authority. And they stored them in the World Trade Center. And so on 9/11, among the other things that was lost were all copies of that film. It would have been gone forever, except we had our copy. And we gave ours, by the way, back to the Port Authority later on. We struck a copy. We just simply ran, without comment, we ran the topping out ceremony of the North Tower in December 1971, which sort of needed no explanation. Everybody at that point knew what it was. You see the last girders come up, and you see the construction workers on the top, and they have a little flag and a tree and everything. And we ran a little title that said, "To the Resilience of New Yorkers, Past and Present." We then knew that we had to add an 8th episode to the story. And so we decided to make an 8th episode called Center of the World, about the World Trade Center, to retell the entire New York story through the lens of the World Trade Center, which we did. And that aired in the fall of 2003. And we did a new edition of the book with an extra chapter. We do have a sort of a special guest star here, is Angela Kesselring. And Angela ran the publicity department of a German publishing firm called Frederking und Thaler, based in Munich. And it was actually they who came to us after 9/11, and they said, "We will publish your book in German, the whole book, if you were to write a new chapter about the World Trade Center." And that's how that got started, actually. So we, on their dime, basically, or their mark, Deutschmark, on their euro, we wrote the new chapter. That meant that when it was time to make the episode, we had the actual basis of the script. And that appeared in 2003. And I'm here to tell you that we are currently working on a 9th episode of the New York series, which will air in either fall 2020 or fall 2021. And it will be called The Future of Cities, and it will pick up the story after 9/11. And actually it ratchets back a little bit and tells you the story of the 90s and how New York kind of got out of its problems in a little more clear detail. And then it carries the story forward, more or less, to today. Okay?
The audio now, yeah, it's just the sound, which you know, is so evocative of the series that you don't need to see the video. The problem is, video on YouTube is stretched into widescreen, and so there's short, fat towers, and so you can't stand to see it anyway. I certainly can't. But the audio is
For nearly 30 years, they stood at the foot of Lower Manhattan, two of the tallest and most instantly recognizable structures on Earth, rising at the heart of the most ravishing and well-known skyline in the world, the mightiest and most ambivalent monuments of their age, and, in the end, the most tragic. Conceived in the giddy aftermath of World War II, and rising as America itself rose to global power in the decades following the war, they were destined to become the real and symbolic epicenter of an economic system that would come to dominate much of the face of the planet. More than any other structures of the age, they would be intimately bound up from start to finish with the awesome forces reshaping New York in the second half of the 20th century, and with the even greater forces propelling America itself relentlessly upward and ever outward across an increasingly complex and interconnected globe. Like almost all great skyscrapers, it was fated to be a structure at once of its time, and yet, partly for that reason, poignantly out of time too. Rising at the very end of a great building boom, on the cusp of great change. Raised into the sky during one of the most tumultuous and complex periods in the city's history, by a unique combination of pride, ambition, audacity, greed, idealism, ingenuity, and folly. The colossal towers were, in many ways, the last of their kind, and a mighty culmination. the stunning climax of more than 70 years of building tall on the island of Manhattan, and the last and most controversial of the massive urban renewal projects that would transform New York during the post-war period. The effort it would take just to get them off the ground, to say nothing of raising the two largest structures in the world, more than a quarter of a mile into the sky, from the tangled streets of the most densely concentrated business district on Earth, would require the greatest convergence of public and private power the city had ever seen, and embroil their builders in every conflict and tension of the age. In the end, the extraordinary 50-year saga of the World Trade Center, when and why it was built, how and where it went up, what its great towers stood for, and how and why they fell, would tell more than most people had ever imagined about the city and country that was their home.
So thank you, James, for that. And what is kind of, in a way, fortuitous that that's our moment of solemn remembrance, I think, before we start looking back at the role of Les Robertson. Let's start the video. Les Robertson is I think you all know, is the structural engineer for the World Trade Center.
Everything in the World Trade Center was new. The materials were new, the structure was new, and I was young and confident. But I said to myself, what if something doesn't work? What happens if?
And Les did provide an invention for the building type.
An enormous leap of faith almost for Les. The credibility of the building was really at stake.
He's a critical enabler of critical buildings.
What impressed me the most about the towers was that they stayed up as long as they did.
When the buildings came down, I said, my God, Les will be so destroyed.
And people are trying to get in touch with him, so it was very clear that this is going to become a big part of our lives and a big part of our identity.
World Trade Center as a symbol attracted everything. All the love, all the hate, all the anger, all the pride.
He had joined the U.S. Navy as a young 16-year-old boy. He would become a pacifist.
The hate of war just kept building up inside me, and I said to myself, I'm going to do everything in my life to make it stop.
To be creative, you have to be free, and to be free, you have to fight.
Families of 9/11 victims turned to Les to help in their recoveries, asking him to attend psychotherapy sessions.
I don't know how many letters I got, but just piles of them.
Saltine would become the core, the foundation of his existence.
While he builds great skyscrapers, he thinks about and cares about the life that will go on inside that building and the impact that building will have on the world.
This is the story of the World Trade Center's lead structural engineer and his bond with humanity.
If I can't sketch it, I can't design it. Sketching to me is the road to design. You make the first sketch because you're trying to sort out in your mind what it is you're designing. The mind sees one thing, and when you start making a sketch, you start changing it a little bit here and there, and I have to see something more tangible than a bunch of numbers. And the advantage of thinking and sketching is you can do it really fast, and it keeps your mind flowing instead of closing in. It's often in the world where I live, in the world of architecture, that an idea gels really fast. And the concept of the World Trade Center came together with enormous rapidity. Sure, after we got started on it, it got taller, and there were changes, of course, constantly evolving. But the fundamental of it was born almost immediately. And it was born, in my view, more as a sculptural form than as an architectural one. And indeed, later on, when the architectural world kind of turned away from the project, although it later returned, but it turned away for many years. It still remained in the heart and minds of sculptors as a beautiful place in New York City. The Empire State Building was designed and constructed in incredibly short length of time, and I think it's a real tribute both to the architecture and the engineering and the people who financed it, and the city of New York for that matter. It's a magnificent building. It's entirely different in terms of my work, the structural work, from the World Trade Center. For example, it has in it a steel frame. But that steel frame was designed to carry all of the loads that the designers thought would be on the building. They were wrong by a significant margin in terms of the magnitude of the loads. But they created their design based on experience in the past. And so even though the steel frame was in fact not adequate to carry the loads that would in fact go in the building, the system, which consisted of the steel frame and all of the masonry in the building, was quite strong enough to do the job. The two buildings. People looked at the buildings and called them twin towers. I never thought of them as twin towers. To me, they each had its own personality.
Eternal twins, perhaps.
Well, yes, mental twins, but they were not the same. So if you took an element, say one of the columns, in identical location on each facade, there would be two you would think would be the same. They were not. And then you go around the corner, they were not, nor were these, nor were these. And the two buildings were different because the wind loads on the two buildings were different. Because one, in a sense, shielded the other from winds in one direction, and the other shielded it from winds in the other direction. So to me, the two towers were quite unique, and I thought of them that way. They were not. We call them A and B or North and South, and I always hoped that they would eventually get names like real things. Never did, I guess.
My name is Annice Alt, and I'm here in the home of Richard Roth Jr. to interview him about the long career of Emmy Roth and Sons Architects.
Well, Emmy Roth and Sons was founded in the late 30s, but the firm really started in 1903 as Emmy Roth Architect. Emmy Roth and Sons as a firm had a different modus operandi than most architectural firms do. To begin with, it was a family company, and it was run by my father, my uncle, and a controller.
Name your father.
My father was Richard Roth Sr., and my uncle was Julian Roth, who was not an architect. Julian was trained basically in construction and ran that part of the office. He also did the contract work. We established a contract not like in the AIA contract, and we had our own contract the clients would sign, most. The firm was broken down into departments, starting off with the design department, who would take a project and do the sketch of what they thought it should look like. It was then transferred to the design development department, separate people, who then developed that design into preliminary working drawings. Those preliminary working drawings then were sent to the production department, which was divided into sections. One section did the plans, horizontal. The other section did the vertical, the details. After the drawings were done and sent out for bids, shop drawings would come in. A separate department did the shop drawings. All of this was in conjunction of the people who had worked on the project to make sure that from the design through the production, it was what was wanted. Most of the design was based on the zoning code because the client bought the property based on what he could put on it and what he could rent for it. So there was no room for extravagance. There was no room for not building as big a building as possible.
Hi, Richard.
Now this is going to be a little scary, but here he is.
If one saw the full 90 minutes of the interview I did with him, you would see that they had still a different way of working on the World Trade Center, and I won't begin to describe it, but what he first said, we didn't do it as AIA specified, we did it our way, but then when working with the Port Authority and Yamasaki, who we really admired, it was still different.
Maybe Richard wants it. Richard, you can hear us and respond?
I really didn't hear you when you...
Okay, well, all right.
I heard part of it.
Okay, well, we'll get you next time. He's supposed to be able to hear through this microphone. The microphone is actually for him to hear rather than for them to hear, although we can turn that up. Dan, you going to turn the microphone up?
Yes.
Okay.
Carol, I hear you perfectly.
Okay, well, unless you have to sit, thank you. Unless you have to sit closer.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Well, I don't know, shop drawings were very different. And first of all, I was, my prior experience in buildings was got all the way up to 20 floors. I was a high-rise expert, and people like Julian particularly who knew everything about how to build in New York City, and I knew nothing about how to build in New York City. So we learned together. I mean, maybe I taught him a little, and he taught me a lot, and so forth. And Jan was a different character completely. I mean, to say the least, he was an alcoholic, and so basically he worked in the morning, and then we'd go to lunch, and he would have his sake martinis, and I would head back for New York. He was not as working with most architects at all. I'm not implying that he ever let off on the project, because he was a very stern thinker and not able even to have his ideas modified, not very much.
So, Richard, were you able to hear those remarks?
I heard about the martinis.
Yeah. I mean, the idea, the concept was that that is going to pick up everything so that Richard can hear it, and then the rest of the people can hear it as well.
I'll just put it like that and see if that works.
Okay, Richard, are you hearing us all right?
I hear you perfectly.
Yeah, and is there, what would you like to add about the time that the office worked on the World Trade Center? I remember you saying that you had something like the office expanded to something like 200 architects in order to do the drawings?
We had a lot of people. I don't remember whether it was 200, but it was certainly more than 100. The Port Authority made us draw every floor, even though every floor was pretty much the same, except when you change the elevator banks. Why they did this, they never could explain. But we had people who worked on one sheet for weeks, if not months. In fact, we had one girl who actually quit and had a nervous breakdown because she spent so much time on a drawing.
Did you have many women in the office?
The office was the World Trade Center was done in a separate office. I think we were on the 8th floor. It was done, I think, on the 12th floor. Les would remember better. He spent time there. I really didn't.
Do you remember?
How could I forget? No, going to the Roth office was very simple. We would get together for a small meeting in their office, and then we would go to lunch. And it was interesting because it was not a very democratic affair. That is, Julian and Miss Beale, etc., would have a glass of something, but John Doe, architect, no.
They weren't allowed. The architects who had to do the drawings, pencil drawings.
We would depart leaving.
Unless they were having lunch with me.
But what I know from the photographs of this is that everybody had either a cigarette or a pipe in their mouth at the time, too, right? Must have been the combination of tobacco and alcohol must have really been deadly for that generation of architects.
Well, I'm not sure about smoking. I started when I was 13 and quit when I was 19 or 20, so it was not me smoking.
You still there? Do you have any thoughts?
I have a question. Would there be a way of saying that there was a handoff of the design in the conventional terms of schematics, design development, and then construction drawings? Would it be fair to say that somehow the design got handed off from Yamasaki's office to Emory Roth and you, or was it more complicated than that and more circular? I mean, was there a point where they basically gave you a set of sheets of drawings and said, you take it from here, or did it not work out?
No, the project was constantly changing, and we did, I'm sure, had, which was like the schematics, design development, etc. But for us, it was a kind of ongoing design process of trying to keep up, because Yamasaki's firm, while they were not the working drawing architect, they were not adverse to dabbling in any part of the work, nor was Emmy Roth and Sons. Both firms had their own identity, and I'm not sure how well they got along, but I believe they got along pretty well.
May I say, at no point was Yama's office not involved.
That's true. Never.
Yeah.
I mean, the airplane tickets between New York and Detroit were rather expensive, and we used a lot of them.
Well, there's another character.
At no point was Yama not involved.
There's another character in the project we haven't mentioned. That's Malcolm P. Levy, who was basically our contact with Port Authority. I guess there was an investigation, and they found that some of Mal Levy's expense accounts were not accurate. I understood perfectly, and that is, he would throw papers at his secretary, and she would make his expense account and turn it in, and she would add whatever was necessary in order to fill it out. And I think Port Authority was way off base in bringing up the charges, and I attended the sessions, and I was very verbal and objecting to the way he was treated. But he was a very powerful influence on everyday life of the development of our work.
So one of the aspects a lot of people don't know about the World Trade Center is that the original intent was not to build the world's tallest building, but that the extra 10 floors or so that were added once the range had been achieved in order to be within striking distance of the tallest record, then you made the adjustment. So we know a little bit about the change of added height, What about the floor plans? Since we have you both here to talk about the floor plans, was the square? How was the square? The dimensions of the square set?
I don't really know. I mean, I think law firm might know better than me.
Richard, so I think it's like 209 feet on the side, right?
I have no idea how the, except it was an acre, wasn't it?
Yeah.
200 by 0.
I don't think that's why they took the 200 dimension out.
But I think this was part.
My
5 acres.
Yeah, no, but the floor, each floor was about 202 by 202, something like that.
209
by 209. What I find interesting is that the whole economic rationale of the project, I don't know how to say this politely, but didn't really make sense and was quickly shown to not make sense. That the idea of a trade center, the idea that you would have all these companies related to world trade, which was after all what it was supposed to be about, on floors together, just didn't make sense. The companies didn't want to be next to each other. They would see, for all kinds of reasons that had to do with competition and confidentiality and being able to see who was coming in and out. A moment's thought would make you realize that you don't want your competitor to see what client you have who's coming in. So it didn't really make sense to gather all these companies on the same floor, certainly, and probably not in the same complex with the same elevator banks. And my understanding is that, relatively quickly it became evident by 1968-69 as they were trying to rent the space that this was a kind of a notion, basically, and a way they had sold the project to get Governor Rockefeller and the port to, agree to it, but that it was going to be used as conventional office space, basically. It was going to be a conventional office building. And I guess the question would be, how did that kind of thinking enter into either of your thinking about the project?
May I say a word? The only firm, let me say, that I visited was the New York State Department of Social Services. They had to
in the World Trade Center.
In the World Trade Center, you couldn't get enough commercial renters, so they used it for state office.
Okay. Nelson Rockefeller.
But you used the word that I heard in the trailer in 2002, but I guess the concept for that came earlier. You used the word gigantism, which is the same word that I've used as a historian in order to represent not just the World Trade Center, but the Sears Tower and that generation. So we're, as historians, we're very much on the same page of interpreting what happened in that era. So I guess the question is, why did it happen in that era, in your view?
Well, actually, I was going to talk about a different subject because, for example, we did a lot of work in bringing up a new technology called wind engineering into the vocabulary of structural engineers.
We didn't show that clip, but there's plenty of them that people can watch on
the
link.
And so, as the project developed, we came to realize two things. One is that if we could rotate the South Tower 90 degrees, we could save a lot of money. And so I didn't go to Port Authority. And we had lunch together.
Maybe you should explain what that means. From the outside, the buildings looked identical. But inside, the cores of the buildings were rectangular, not square.
Right.
And I can't remember, let's see, basically created an L shape that had to do, as my understanding, with wind loads and some other questions that you had.
No, I think that layout was purely architectural. With Julian's staff heavily involved in that development.
Well, Richard, do you have any remembrance?
No, I was, by this time I was not part of the project.
But anyway, so we turned the South Tower 90 degrees. I went to see Jan about it, and he said no, which is sort of a standard answer, but I had worked with him a lot. I mean, I knew how to put ideas into his head, and I kept at it. And another person, Aaron Schreier, who was the architect, who basically was the head of the World Trade Center architectural Yamasaki group. Brilliant guy. Not a lot older than me, but a bit older than me, and a lot more experienced. And anyway, he's the one who convinced him to make the change. And then, never when to start dabbling, we decided that we would increase the size, the width, particularly of the perimeter columns, a little bit. Again, a lot of money could be saved, and that involved reducing the number of columns on each of the 4 walls by 1, taking that dimension and adding it to the other columns. And again, Aaron was instrumental in convincing Yamasaki that should be done. But actually, Yama and I went to see Guy Tazoli about that one too. And Guy was very receptive to that kind of thinking. It saves time and money.
Time and money. The money part is what drives private projects. Was the money part as important to the Port Authority? Because one of the criticisms about the Twin Towers is that it seemed to be an endless budget in effect, or had no budget to it had no profit motive budget to constrain it.
I'm sure that's the case, but I was really not involved in that. My job was to.
So it's pure engineering elegance that was driving your suggestions?
Engineering elegance. It was a matter of fact of life that by turning the columns, by reducing the columns, the number of columns, by turning the core, things like that. I mean, that's what I do for a living. I mean,
yeah. Well, I would call that engineering elegance.
Vault was put at the very top of the North Tower, I think, a long time ago. North Tower. A vault has concrete walls, so thick, floors so thick, ceiling so thick and so forth, very heavy. And we got a complete set of drawings on how to incorporate that vault into the building. And I instantly rebelled. That's sort of my nature, I think. And I said, well, if we do this, this is late in the game, we have to reinforce all the columns. That's most of the columns in the core would have to be reinforced down a ways. And all the time there's mechanical, electrical, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And they'd have to do the drawings.
And I said to myself, what can I do about that? And so I decided to span the vault, the full width of the core, length of the core, I should say. So we didn't put any load on it, just the 4 columns, not the load. Again, save lots of money and move the project ahead. I mean, that's what we do.
So, one of the towers had a restaurant.
Yes.
Windows on the world.
Yes. So where was the vault in that tower?
I can't remember which.
Windows was in the north, and Windows was in the
the whole floor.
I'm trying to remember now. Windows was in the north, and the top of the rock, top of the world, they called it, or whatever it was on the south side. I have a related question, which was.
But that's different from the vault.
Different from the vault.
I don't know which tower it was in, but it was not
only
at the
one
very top.
tower had the
It was
vault?
underneath the people's spaces in the shop.
I remember hearing a story that Yamasaki wanted to bring the piers up uninterrupted to the roof, but because they became aware at some point that they were going to have a fancy restaurant that was going to be the equivalent, really, I guess, of the Rainbow Room in the mind of the Port Authority, and an observation deck to be the equivalent of the very popular, obviously very popular Empire State Building and RCA building, that they requested that you change the centers, basically widen the windows and draw the columns together. And I wondered, and I am working on a book ultimately about observation decks, so this is of interest, enormous interest to me. Do you recall those conversations and how that went on? Yeah.
Of course it is. But that's just one at the top of the building. I mean, how about the fact that after all the steelwork was purchased and ordered and most of it erected, you decided to put a 440-foot high tower on top of the North Tower? Right? So, you know, we worked out a system so that the load didn't go down the way they thought it would go down. We spread it out over the whole of the core and the outside wall, everything in order to preserve as much of that which was already fabricated structure.
So every time there was an adjustment in the design, there was a kind of plan B in order to address that, not from the original concept, but from a new concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting question because I think most of the time the engineer doesn't get so involved in the sort of detail of the work. But we did a lot of work on the lateral stability of elevators, how to park the floor, how to park elevators in the tower, in the case of windstorm, and etc. I think that the coordination between architecture in the design, architecture in the construction document, which really, to me, was one subject, because it acted like one subject, and the engineering, which was heavily into the architecture and design, and mechanical, and electrical.
Should we give the audience the opportunity? Is there anyone who has an urgent, important question?
Could you explain what a vault is? What is the function of it?
It holds money.
No, I mean, that's what you're talking about? In the building?
But in order to put all that wealth inside of a space, you have to provide a very heavy fire resistance.
Did the vault survive the 9/11? No.
No, of course not. I mean, it fell all the way from the top to the bottom of it. It was heavy and strong, but not that strong.
But my understanding, there was all kinds of treasures at the base of the building that belonged to banks, and they were in fact able to get that out.
A lot could be taken out. It was not.
After the fact?
They were deep. You know, the building had, what, 6 sub-basements, something like that. Or 7 maybe. 7. Yeah. And there was, at the bottom of the bottom, there was gold and all kinds of other things.
Etc.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question that they want to ask? Take the opportunity.
Okay.
Yes.
What was the animating cause to build the buildings? I guess conceived sometime in the 60s.
I can speak a little to it. It's a story we tell in the series. We actually draw the story back to way earlier than that, to about 1946 or 47. And we explain it as part of a kind of thinking that had to do with all the rethinking, I mean, of the whole modern world being created in those important years after World War II, where the modern economic system of the world was really invented, you know, the Bretton Woods Agreement and NATO and the Marshall Plan and all of that. And the notion that the United States had to kind of step up to take the role that it probably should have taken after World War I from Great Britain as the kind of guarantor of economic and military peace and exchange, but had not done so because of, you know, if you remember your history, the League of NATO, Wilson and Congress not being wanted to be part of the League of Nations and so forth. Isolationism sweeping over the United States in the 1920s. But obviously after World War II, there was no question. That day was gone. And the notion was that there would be, you know, a whole series of interlocking political and military organizations that would preserve the peace physically. But in addition, there would be a whole system of economic models. And that inevitably was a little bit more to do with, less with Washington, D.C., and more to do with New York. Of course, although New York had a very important role in it as what became the home of the United Nations, which was one of the organizations that was going to do this. And a kind of, the people who were coming up with this were in fact New York bankers. They were the people who worked for Franklin Roosevelt, Robert Lovett and Atchison, and these really tough guys, but with a very expansive idea, which meshed perfectly with the Rockefellers' own idea of kind of broad sense of expansion, and specifically with the Chase Bank's interventionist global outlook, which was not shared by many institutions. Banks were not international organizations in those days. Certainly American banks were not, but the Chase Bank was. And the young, up-and-coming bright light of the Chase Bank, David Rockefeller, ultimately to be its CEO, had this vision that New York should become a kind of, really basically take over from London as the center of world economic activity. And that around that time, the concept of a world trade center, although people didn't know exactly what it was going to be, began to emerge. The idea that New York's, of course, New York was the undisputed port city of the United States and indeed of the world, and would remain so for a couple of decades, and had been by that time for a number of decades. And so the idea was to build upon that maritime supremacy by creating some kind of institution that would have trade floors and other kinds of exchanges and office space where international business could be done. And the original drawings and concepts of it showed it fairly close to where the South Street Seaport is now, on the Water Street side, in a series of buildings that I think Emory Roth might have drawn up. Yeah.
No.
And they were not super tall. They were about 30 and 40 stories on a big podium, or it was Skidmore. Skidmore did it, yeah. And that sort of bubbled along through the 1950s and 60s. And but it gained speed when David Rockefeller's brother was elected the governor of New York State, which nobody could figure out how to build it. When I say how to build it, not from an engineering point of view, but who would finance it? How would it be created? What was the commercial mechanism? Private developers didn't see the point of it. They were very happy building their office buildings and so forth. So the Chase Bank couldn't build it by itself. Indeed, the Chase Bank built their own headquarters, which Skidmore did, One Chase Plaza. But they couldn't build this. So the big aha moment came with the idea of the election of Governor Rockefeller that Nelson could build David's project, basically. He could figure out a way in which the state of New York would be able to get the mechanism to build, the bonding mechanism and so forth, to build this. And that's what they did, basically. Even though many people at the time said, why should the Port Authority of New York, wasn't yet the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the Port of New York Authority, which his job it is to build port facilities and marine facilities, and okay, airports, and yes, the Holland Tunnel, not the Lincoln Tunnel, and so on. Why would they be building office space? What's the, there were plenty of private developers in New York who said that's not right. And they had to convince, everyone basically that it was a proper thing to do. It helped that the Port Authority had enormous autonomy. They had their own funding, their own bonding. They could do pretty much whatever they wanted. And in it, they found a mechanism by which they could build the project. The last hurdle they had to fulfill was that it was, even though it was called the Port of New York Authority, it was a bi-state agency, half run by the state of New Jersey. And New Jersey looked at it and said, why should we be helping pay for this project on the east side of Manhattan? And they couldn't figure that out for a while. It looked like it was going to go down. It was not going to happen. But, and I've heard versions of this story, that there was a related problem, that was the old Hudson tubes, as my mother used to call them. And the Hudson tubes were in terrible shape. They were running back and forth, big commuter line. And they had the property, the old Hudson and Manhattan terminal buildings that were over on the west side. And there was a discussion at the Port Authority as the quid pro quo, that what New Jersey would get if they accepted this new project on the east side of Manhattan was to take over the Port Authority, to take over the Trans-Hudson tubes. And then suddenly there was a moment, and I've heard various people ascribed to being the person who thought it up. What if we took the property that we got with the Port Authority, with the Trans-Hudson tubes, and we put the World Trade Center over there? Suddenly everything seemed to work, because now you would have a great new station for the Trans-Hudson tubes. The transportation, which was bad on the east side, was good on the west side. It faced New Jersey and was connected because of the Trans-Hudson tubes. You could easily imagine people from New Jersey working there, and it was much easier to sell. And also, you got the land with it, so, or half of the land, the land side part. They still had to condemn what was called Radio Row. And that's made it all happen. And late, they said, and they huddled in the Gramercy Park Hotel, I was told, in Christmas time, 1962. And they came up with the scheme. And that's the way I heard the story. Thank you.
And they did not consult the structural engineer.
And they didn't consult it.
Jersey still had to be brought on board, and they got the container ship facility to quell their objections. As I understand it, there's some, I'm blanking on the name of the book, I believe it was City in the Sky, talked about that whole deal. But Jersey, so, why are we supporting a real estate development in New York City? And what are we getting, for our participation? And that's how that happened.
That's a related subject, a great subject, but Austin Tobin, the head of the Port Authority, was a visionary. And he, this man McLaren, had already shown in the late 40s, early 50s, this new idea of containerized system. And of course, it had a lot of advantages. The one nobody wanted to talk about was the fact that it was a sealed container, and you couldn't get into it. And New York, of course, a la legendary on the waterfront, had a terrible problem with corruption on the waterfront, and people taking basically 1 out of every 10 bananas as their commission, so to speak.
It was worse than that, because the union wage was based on the value of the shipment, and to this day, New York leads in the shipment of empty containers.
Well, it was plain that the future lay in containers, and Tobin, in a role that I don't think is sufficiently appreciated, led that. And of course, it wouldn't work that one port that had containers. He worked with the Port of Rotterdam, and he got them to agree to do it, or they agreed together to do it, and suddenly they were in business. And what was also very obvious was that Manhattan, the west side of Manhattan, the Hudson River, old Hudson River piers, wouldn't possibly have the upland room to deal with these huge container ports. It was going to have to go to New Jersey. And that was obviously a very monumental change.
We need to wrap up in a minute, and by way of concluding, James, thank you for that masterful overview of what I understand with the World Trade Center in the context of New York's story and a global history. But I wanted to ask Les and Richard about a theme that is in the clips that we didn't show, and I do encourage everybody to go to the PBS site and to see the rest of those clips, or to see your the Leaning Out documentary. You talk a lot about how the World Trade Center was a young people's project for you. It was an incredibly ambitious project for the Port Authority and everybody else involved. Can you put into context away from your personal ambition to build a great modern building and to demonstrate new principles about architecture and engineering, how the youth and the ambition of this project figured at the scale at which it operated? What is the relationship of kind of the personal story as you felt it yourself, but also could see other people operating in that arena, or in that small arena, in the kind of boxing match arena of the kinds of tensions in business and politics that were involved. Did you witness that, or was that something that was outside of your experience of the project?
Outside my experience, I had the blinders on and get the design done and get the building built. And that was my goal. The trades and all the rest of that was not
But you went to the meetings where everybody said, we're going to build the world's tallest building, we're going to build the world's biggest building in terms of its floor area. Oh, how are we going to fill that up? Must have, been a part of the conversation.
It was, but I didn't listen very carefully.
Well, I think we need to conclude, although we have the opportunity for a reception for some water and some wine over there, and you can, meet Les and James has some books in the bookstore as well that we didn't bring up, but have the opportunity to now thank them for their work and for sharing their work with us this evening.
Great.
Les, you want to tell us how you feel about seeing yourself almost 20 years ago in that interview?
I was a trifle younger. No, actually, the project was on the engineering side particularly, but on the architectural side also. It was the young person's project. It was not a place where the highly experienced person. It was not a place where the highly experienced person would win his baton. So it was easy, I think, very easy for us because we were all very young, and we were friends, not just amongst the youngsters, but friends with the older ones like Julian and Yama and Guy Tizzoli, and you want to go down the list. So we didn't sort of think of ourselves the way these films showed us. We were a team, not an individual.
Could you talk maybe about the relationship of the architects of record and how you worked with the Port Authority, how Yamasaki and you worked in the design phase, and how the Port Authority coordinated the shop drawings and the whole production?
I didn't know they did that.
Maybe they didn't. You're telling us.
The shop drawings came in our door, and came into Roth's door, and we reviewed them. And we worked very carefully with the fabricator. We had, I want to say 24, 25, 26 somewhere in there, different fabricators of structural steel. And so it was necessary to coordinate between the fabricators. We were not just checking their work, but it was looking at the integration of 2 or 3 or 4 different fabricators on the same problem.
Annice, you wanted to?
Yes.
Here we are.
This should be picking up everybody, so maybe we need
I see you.
Great.
Yay.